Bore da pawb. Good morning, everybody. This is your do now activity for today. So your wneud nawr. There are 3 questions about plants and animals. This will be relevant to your lesson today. So if you could pause the video here to answer these 3 questions, and then we'll go through them in a few seconds. Okay, so hopefully you guys have answered those questions. So now I'm going to go through the answers. Number 1 was, what type of energy do plants absorb to make their own food? The answer to that is sunlight. So that's light energy. Okay. Number 2, name 2 animals that only eat plants. So I'm just going to pick 2 random animals. So I'm going to say a rabbit and a cow. Okay, so you could have any 2 animals as long as they only eat plants. And number 3 is the same. Name 2 animals that only eat meat. So I'm just going to pick 2 random ones. I'm going to say lion and a fox. Okay, so as long as you've picked 2 animals that only eat meat, that's right. Okay, so give yourselves a mark out of 3 for that, and we'll move on to today's lesson. Alright, so today's lesson is about food chains and webs. In Welsh, cadwyni bwyd a gweoedd. Your date today is dydd Llun 22 Chwefror. Your learning objectives for today is to understand how ecosystems interact in the form of food chains and food webs in order to transfer energy, and also to understand pyramids of number and biomass. Your keywords today are ecosystem, biomass, herbivore, carnivore, producer, and consumer. So the first thing we're going to look at today is ecosystems. So an ecosystem is where plants and animals live and interact with each other. And some of those interactions include food chains and food webs. So on the right here, I've got 2 different pictures of different ecosystems. So the first one is in a river. We've got stuff like tadpoles, frogs, flies, water weeds, snails, and obviously the sun. And in the forest ecosystem, some of the animals we can see here are owls, foxes, hedgehogs, rabbits, deers, squirrels, and obviously trees, bushes, and a lot of plants. And then the sun would obviously shine through the trees. So there are both animals and plants in both of these ecosystems, and they will interact. Okay, so the main thing we're going to look at today is food chains. So in Welsh that would be cadwyni bwyd. We have a little vocab list on the side here that I'm going to go through first, because this vocab is essential for all of the parts of today's lesson. So we'll just go through them one by one. The first one is producer. So producers are organisms that make their own organic nutrients or food, and that's usually using energy from sunlight. A primary consumer is the first animal in the chain, usually eating plants, which would make them a herbivore. So then the next one, herbivore, an animal that only eats plants. A carnivore is an animal that only eats other animals, so meat. A secondary consumer is the second animal in a chain that eats the primary consumer. The tertiary consumer is the third animal in the chain that eats the secondary consumer. And a decomposer eats dead organisms, so that would be dead plants or animals, and other waste. They break down dead plants and animals into nutrients. Okay, so that's our vocab list for today. Now let's look at food chains. So a food chain shows what eats what in a particular habitat. It shows the flow of energy and materials from one organism to the next. So the chain will start with a primary consumer eating a producer. Remember, we said a primary consumer is an animal that eats plants, and a producer is an organism that will make its own food, so that would be a plant. So the example I've put on the slide here, a rabbit would be the primary consumer, and that will eat a carrot, which would be the producer. A secondary consumer would then consume the primary consumer, and a tertiary consumer would consume the secondary one, and so on. So let's look at producers a bit more in depth. So an organism which produces their own food to get energy is known as a producer, and it does not depend on anything else for its food apart from sunlight. Plants are known as producers because they make their own food by the process of photosynthesis. So when we think of producers, we think of plants, algae, and some bacteria. On the other hand, consumers are organisms that eat other living things in order to get energy. So they have to consume something to get their energy in order to survive. So all living things except for plants, algae, and some bacteria that we just mentioned are consumers. So all living things are either a producer or a consumer. We just said what the producers are. Everything else will be a consumer. Consumers include herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, and decomposers. So we said earlier, a herbivore is an animal that only eats plants. A carnivore is an animal that only eats meat and other animals. An omnivore is an animal that can eat both plants and animals. And a decomposer is something that eats dead plants and animals. Consumers will consume other organisms to get energy. So that last point there is a very easy definition for you guys to remember. Consumers consume other organisms to get energy. Okay, so now we have review 1, adolygiad 1. There's 3 questions and then a challenge at the end. So if you could pause the video here to answer these, and then we'll go through them in a second. Alright, so hopefully you've answered these and maybe even tried the challenge at the bottom. So question 1, what is the definition of a producer? So I'll write this answer in now. A producer produces its own nutrients, put in brackets food, e.g. plants, brackets photosynthesis. Okay, so I've said a producer produces its own nutrients or food, and an example of that is plants that use photosynthesis to make their own food. Okay, number 2, what is the difference between a primary consumer and a secondary consumer? So I'll put P for primary and S for secondary. Okay, so primary consumer consumes the producer, so it is a herbivore because it eats plants, and a secondary consumer is a carnivore because it consumes the primary consumer. Okay, so PC there means primary consumer. Number 3, what is a food chain? Okay, so a food chain shows what eats what in an ecosystem. Okay, so that's the first point, and then the second point, it shows the flow of energy from one organism to the next. I can't fit that on the screen, so shows the flow of energy from one organism to the next. Okay, and finally at the bottom here we've got our challenge. So this says, try to think of a food chain that starts with grass as a producer. So we can write in grass at the start. Then that can go to, I'm going to write rabbit for my food chain. Rabbit. Now we have to think, what would eat a rabbit? A fox. And what would eat a fox? A lion. Okay, so our producer is grass. Our primary consumer that eats the grass is the rabbit. Our secondary consumer that would eat the rabbit is our fox. And the tertiary consumer, which would eat our fox, is a lion. And because nothing really is a predator to a lion and would eat the lion, that is the top of the food chain. Okay, so the lion is the top of this food chain, so it goes from grass to a lion. So give yourselves a mark for the 3 questions, and then a bonus mark if you tried the challenge. Okay, so now let's look at some examples of food chains. So this is a food chain with a producer, a primary consumer, and a secondary consumer. So we've got corn as our producer, so it makes food from sunlight as it is a plant. We have a rat that would eat that. So our rat is the primary consumer, it is a herbivore because it's eating a plant. And we have an owl that would eat our rat, and that's the secondary consumer, which makes it a carnivore because it's eaten the rat. So this is quite a simple and short food chain. Next we'll look at a food chain with 4 things in it. Okay, so our producer here is a carrot. We could also have grass because rabbits would eat grass. So our producer makes food from sunlight. So our primary consumer is the rabbit. It's a herbivore because it eats the producer, which is the carrot. Then the fox is our secondary consumer, which eats the rabbit, makes it a carnivore. And our tertiary consumer is a lion, also a carnivore because it eats the fox. Okay, so some food chains are different lengths. So this one has 4 things in it. The next one we're going to look at has 5 things in it. Okay, so here we have some grass as our producer, makes food from sunlight. Our primary consumer this time is an insect. It's a herbivore because it eats the grass. Our secondary consumer is a frog. It's a carnivore because it eats our insect. And then a snake will eat the frog. So the snake is our tertiary consumer, also a carnivore. And then the word we use for the 4th thing in the line is quaternary. So our quaternary consumer would be an eagle. So that would eat the snake. So that's also a consumer. So this is a slightly longer chain. So it goes from a producer through 4 different consumers. Because nothing will eat the eagle, that would be the top of our food chain, so our chain would end there. But then if something higher up were to eat our quaternary consumer, the chain would continue. Okay, so review 2, adolygiad 2. I want you to label each of these pictures with whether they are a producer or a consumer. And a challenge on top, which I think is more than doable. Label which of the consumers are herbivores and which are carnivores. Okay, so I've used all of the same animals that I just went through on my slides. So there's rabbit, lion, rat, eagle, grass, snake, etc. So it's all the same pictures, so hopefully you'll be able to do this. So pause the video here. Get a piece of paper, just write down the name of the thing. So say if you were going to do rabbit, just write down rabbit, whether it's a producer or consumer, and if it's a consumer, whether it's a herbivore or a carnivore. Okay? Okay, so hopefully you're back. You've labelled all of these pictures. I'm going to use a color code to make it easier for you guys. So I'm going to do green for producer, red for consumer. Okay, so we'll do that first. So I'll go through and do all of the producers first. Okay, so I'll just put a little squiggle by each one. So producers, we've got this corn here, so I'll put a squiggle there. The carrot and the grass. Okay, so all of the plants are producers, and then all of the other ones are consumers. So we've got our rabbit, our lion, insect, owl, frog, eagle, rat, fox, and snake. Okay, so I've got a green squiggle next to all of the producers and a red squiggle next to all of the consumers. So give yourself a mark for each of the ones you got right, you label correctly. And now we'll do the challenge, which is label which of the consumers are herbivores and which are carnivores. So in blue pen, I'm going to write next to each of the consumers, I'll put a H for herbivore and a C for carnivore, okay? So we have a rabbit, which is a herbivore, because remember we had it eating the carrot. Our lion was a carnivore because it ate the fox. The insect was a herbivore because it ate the grass. The owl was a carnivore because it ate the rat. The frog was a carnivore because it ate the insect. The eagle was a carnivore because it ate the snake. The rat was a herbivore because it ate the corn. The fox was a carnivore because it ate the rabbit. And the snake was a carnivore because it ate the frog. Okay, so I've put a H and a C next to all of those. So give yourself a mark for each of those that you got right. And then we'll move on to the next part of the lesson. Okay, so now I want you guys to think of other primary consumers that would eat grass. Okay, so what primary consumers, so what animals do you know of that would eat grass? So pause the video here, make a little list on a piece of paper, and then I'll say some that I've thought of, and hopefully we've thought of some of the same ones. Okay, so this is the list of primary consumers that I thought of that would eat grass. So we've got a grasshopper, mice, caterpillars, rabbits, cows, sheep, deer, and there's probably loads more. So you might have thought of completely different ones to me, but these are the ones I thought of that are herbivores and they eat grass. Okay, so next task. Can we think of any secondary consumers that would eat this insect? So just make a list of animals you think would eat an insect. So pause the video here, write a little list, and then I'll show you my list and hopefully we have some of the same. Okay, so this is the list I came up with. So on my list I've got frogs, birds, lizards, anteaters, armadillos, aardvarks, pangolins, bats, spiders, and many more. So there might be some animals on that list that you might not have heard of. Hopefully you've heard of frogs, birds and lizards, and also spiders, so maybe some of them were on your list. So those animals on my list are secondary consumers, so they would eat our primary consumer, which in this example is our insect, which means all of these animals are carnivores. We could probably think of many tertiary consumers that can consume all of these animals. When there are multiple animals that can eat the same animal in a food chain, the food chains can overlap. When this happens multiple times, we have to use a food web instead, where all the food chains are interacting with each other. Okay, so we'll look at food webs now, which in Welsh is gwioedd bwyd. In the food web, there are multiple food chains that interact with each other. It represents a multiple pathway by which energy and nutrients flows from one organism to another organism in the form of food. So we can see in this picture, we can see the food chains are oak tree to squirrel to fox. Okay, so we can see, I'll draw it on. So the oak tree goes to squirrel and then down to the fox, which means the squirrel eats the oak tree and the fox eats the squirrel. Another chain I can see in this picture is oak tree to earthworm to wood mouse to fox. So I'll use a different colour. I'll use green. So we've got oak tree to earthworm to wood mouse to fox. Okay, so that's another food chain that I can see here. And the third one I can see, I'll use a red arrow this time. Again, we go oak tree to earthworm, earthworm to wood mouse. So that's the same food chain so far, but another thing that can eat a wood mouse is an owl. Okay, so this time the owl eats our wood mouse. So our tertiary consumer is different this time. So we can clearly see here the oak tree is the producer, so that is the first step in all of these chains. Squirrels and earthworms are the primary consumers I can see here in this food web. The wood mice and the foxes are secondary consumers. The foxes and owls are tertiary consumers. And the fungi and earthworms are decomposers as well. So there's a lot going on in this picture. So there's a few things that are more than one type of consumer depending on what they're eating or what is near them. So this is an example of how a lot of things can interact and how multiple things can eat the same animal. Okay, so now I'd like you to do review 3, adolygiad tri. So there's 3 questions here, asking the difference between a food chain, a food web, and what you can see from this food web picture. Okay, so what are the producers and the tertiary consumers in this food web? So if you could pause the video here, answer these 3 questions, and then we'll go through them in a second. Okay, so we had question 1 earlier on in the lesson, but it's very important that you guys know the definition of a food chain, so I've brought it up again. So a food chain shows the transfer of energy from one organism to the next. Okay, so that's the definition that's good to remember for exam questions. So a food chain shows the transfer of energy from one organism to the next. I'll add on the end, in an ecosystem. Okay, so that's a really good definition for you guys to remember. So if you don't have an answer that looks like this, please could you write that down. Number 2, what is the definition of a food web? Okay, so a food web is slightly different to a food chain. There are multiple food chains interacting. Okay, so that's the first point I'm going to make. The second point is it represents multiple pathways of energy transfer. Okay, so what I said earlier in the lesson is that it represents a multiple pathway by which energy and nutrients flows from one organism to another in the form of food. So I've just shortened that here so that a food web is multiple pathways of energy transfer from one organism to another organism in the form of food. Okay, so number 3, what are the producers and tertiary consumers in this food web? So hopefully you had a good look at this food web. We can see here that all of the arrows begin at this point. So that means that grass is our producer because it is the start of all of our chains. We can see here that slug, insect and rabbit eat the grass, so that makes them our primary consumers. We can see that a fox, a frog, a vole and a thrush are all secondary consumers. And also we can see that a frog, a fox and a hawk are the tertiary consumers, and because those are at the top of our picture, there's no arrows coming from them, we know those are the top of our food chains. So I'll write this at the bottom, that a fox and a hawk are the tertiary consumers. So hopefully you got that one right. I know the fox was quite confusing because it was a secondary consumer in one of our chains, but it was a tertiary consumer in another one. So hopefully you've got the answer that grass is the producer and the fox and the hawk are the tertiary consumers. So give yourselves a mark out of 4 for this one. So 1 mark for question 1, 1 mark for question 2, and 2 marks for question 3, 1 for the producer, 1 for the tertiary consumers. Right, okay, and another thing to think about, what would happen if the population of slugs decreased in this food web? So instead of decreased, let's just say that the slugs go extinct. What would then happen in this food web if the things that eat the slugs and further up the food chain, what would happen if the slugs disappeared? So the first thing I can see in this picture is that there would be more grass for the insects and the rabbits because the slugs aren't eating any grass. So I'll put on the side here more grass for rabbits and insects. We can see the only thing that actually eats the slug is the thrush by here. So if there were no slugs, the thrush would have to eat something else. The only other thing we can see the thrush eats is the insects. So thrush eat more insects. And that means the population of insects is going to decrease because there are 3 different things eating insects, but now there's more thrushes eating them. So insect population decrease. Okay, so I've done an arrow there for decrease. And if there's less insects to go around, that means that the vole, the frog, the hawk, and the fox will all be affected because the thrush are now eating more insects. So as you can see, there are actually a lot of knock-on effects in a food web because all of these chains are interacting. So it wouldn't just be the grass to slug to thrush to hawk food chain that's affected, it's actually all of the other ones are affected as well. So these relationships and interactions we have within a food web are actually really important and they're really dependent on each other. So again, here's a summary of what we found in this picture. Slugs, rabbits and insects all eat grass. If there were fewer slugs, there would be more grass for the rabbits and insects. And with more food available, those populations would increase. But the thrushes would have to eat more insects to maintain their population. So it's also possible that the population of insects could decrease, and this may reduce the populations of voles and frogs, which would then have an effect on the fox and the hawk. So like I said, in a food web, the changes in population of one organism will have a knock-on effect on the populations of other organisms, and this is called interdependence. So all of the plants and animals in this food web, so in this ecosystem, they will be interdependent on one another. The next part of the lesson, we're going to look at pyramids of number. So a pyramid of numbers shows the population at each stage in a food chain. So that would be the number of plants or animals. It is drawn as a bar chart with the bars stacked on top of each other like a pyramid. The wider the bar, the more organisms it represents. And we always put the producer at the bottom of the pyramid. So here we can see that the bottom of the pyramid is the producer. In this picture it's clover, which is eaten by our snail. So there's a lot of clover at the bottom. So a lot of clover needs to be eaten to get enough energy for the snails. So then there's quite a lot of snails here. So if we just make up some numbers for the example, we could say there's 50 clovers eaten by 30 snails. Okay, so you can see the numbers going down. Our secondary consumer is a thrush. So we can say that there were 15 thrush that ate the 30 snails. So that would be 2 snails per thrush. And then our tertiary consumer at the top of our pyramid is a sparrowhawk. So we could say 2 sparrowhawks at the top of the food chain. So you could see as we move up through the consumers, there are less numbers of animals eating the stage below. Okay, so the biggest is at the bottom with the producer, and then as we move up through the primary consumer through to the tertiary consumer, the numbers decrease, and we can see that because the size of the bars decreases quite a lot by the time we get to the top. But often a pyramid of number doesn't actually look like a pyramid at all. So in the last example it did because we had a lot of plants at the bottom and not many birds at the top. But if we think about it like this, if we had a tree, that would be one tree as a producer. So in this example we have an oak tree, and there's a lot of insects that can feed on that oak tree because it's so big. So we have one oak tree at the bottom, so the bar is very thin at the bottom, but then we have a lot of insects as our primary consumer. So let's say here that we have 50 insects feeding on that one oak tree. So that means our second bar for our primary consumer would be really wide because there's a big number. And then our secondary consumer here is a woodpecker. So the bar is thinner for here. So let's say there's 25 woodpeckers that eat the insects. So this doesn't look like a normal pyramid at all, but it still represents the numbers in the populations of each of the stages. The next type of pyramid we have to look at is the pyramid of biomass. So the word biomass means the total dry mass of one animal or plant species in a food chain or food web. So a pyramid of biomass shows the biomass at each level rather than the population that we would see in a pyramid of number. The biomass goes down from one level to the next, just like the amount of energy would, so the bars always get narrower towards the top. It can be difficult to get valid data for a pyramid of biomass because measuring dry biomass means that all the water has to be removed from the organisms, and an organism may belong to more than one level, so it cannot easily be represented by one bar. Okay, so here's review 4, adolygiad pedwar. So there's 3 questions again for this one. So if you pause the video here and answer these 3 questions and then come back to the video and I'll write the answers in. Okay, so number 1, what does each bar of a pyramid of number represent? So the answer here is the population number of a plant or animal species. Okay, so each bar of a pyramid of number represents the population number of a plant or animal species. Number 2, what order do the bars go in from bottom to top in both pyramids of number and biomass? So they always start with a producer at the bottom and then they move up: primary consumer, secondary consumer, and if there's more, tertiary consumer, and so on. Okay, so they always go in that order with the producer at the bottom. Number 3, why do the bars get narrower towards the top of a pyramid of biomass? And that's because the biomass goes down from one organism to the next. Okay, so another word for goes down would be decreases. So the biomass decreases from one organism to the next, and that's why the bars get narrower towards the top of a pyramid of biomass. So give yourselves a mark out of 3 for this one. That's your last review of this lesson, and I've set you an exam question to do. This is in your class notebook assignment. So if you could fill in your answers for the reviews in this and then answer the exam question at the end and then hand in your work for the lesson and I'll mark it and hand it back. Okay, so thanks for watching, guys.